The rain had been falling for hours over the dark ridgeline of Guadalcanal, and at 3:40 a.m. in October 1942, it soaked through everything, even resolve. Sergeant Basilone lay flat in the mud and crushed leaves, his breath measured, his eyes locked through the scratched scope of a mail-order sporting rifle that no one else in his platoon trusted. Somewhere beyond the dripping palms, unseen shooters had already silenced radio men, medics, and the gunners who kept the perimeter alive. Each loss tightened the noose around the battalion, leaving entire squads frozen where they crouched, afraid that even a careless step would invite a hidden shot. Dawn was coming, and with it the likelihood of a coordinated enemy push that could slip through a line weakened by fear and gaps. Basilone knew this was the moment when a single well-placed round could matter more than 100 hurried ones. Yet the weapon in his hands was not standard issue, only a catalog rifle he understood like an extension of his own body. In the thick, listening jungle, another unseen marksman was searching for him, and the question lingered like the mist. How did a mocked mail-order rifle become so decisive? Long before Guadalcanal, before the heat and the fear and the whispered names of enemy snipers, John Basilone was simply a working-class kid from New Jersey who knew how to make things behave the way they should. He grew up in a house where nothing expensive was wasted and where every tool, from a worn hammer to a battered rifle, was kept in good order through patience and care. Hunting trips and local shooting competitions taught him that accuracy was not magic, but discipline, a steady hand, and an understanding of how a trigger broke and how a barrel breathed. He never pretended to be extraordinary, yet he took quiet pride in doing ordinary things extremely well. The rifle he favored was no military masterpiece. It came from a mail-order catalog, the kind advertised in small print on the back pages of sporting magazines, but Basilone knew every inch of it. He knew the weight of its stock against his shoulder and the slight resistance before the trigger gave way, and that familiarity gave him confidence no regulation firearm could replace. When he enlisted in the Marines, he brought the rifle with him, partly out of habit and partly out of stubborn trust in a tool that had never failed him. In the chaos of training camps and crowded troopships, it was a small piece of home, and no one imagined it would soon shape a battlefield. In 1942, the United States Marine Corps ran on strict doctrine, and nowhere was that more visible than in the rifle platoon. Every man was expected to carry the same government-issued weapon, the same ammunition, and the same field gear, because uniformity was believed to be the backbone of discipline and reliability. Personal equipment was discouraged, and anything that did not come from an official armory was viewed with suspicion. Against that backdrop, Basilone's civilian rifle stood out like a challenge to authority. Officers shook their heads at it, and enlisted men joked that he had brought a hunting toy to a real war. Some called it mail-order junk, unfit for the mud, the rain, and the relentless punishment of the jungle. He was warned more than once that the rifle was not rugged enough, that its parts would fail, and that it simply did not belong on a battlefield. Yet Basilone kept it anyway, slipping it into his kit when he could and cleaning it with more care than some men gave their own helmets. To him, it was not a novelty, but a trusted tool, one he knew could put a bullet exactly where he intended. When Japanese snipers began stalking the perimeter, Command responded with familiar solutions, ordering patrols and calling for heavier firepower, because that was what the manual prescribed. But the shooters were hidden high in the canopy and deep in tangled brush, beyond the reach of standard tactics. Basilone could see what others could not, and he believed his lighter, more precise rifle could reach those shadows. The system still said no, even as the battlefield began to demand something different, and time was slipping away. Guadalcanal in 1942 was not a battlefield so much as a living trap, a humid maze of tangled vines, towering palms, and narrow ridge lines where visibility rarely extended beyond a few dozen yards. The air was thick with heat and insects, and every footstep sank into damp earth that muffled movement but also swallowed sound, making it impossible to know who was near. Japanese forces used this environment with frightening skill, slipping through the jungle at night and leaving behind hidden marksmen who could wait for hours without moving. These snipers did not seek random targets. They aimed for officers, radio operators, and machine gun crews, knowing that a single well-placed shot could unravel an entire unit's ability to fight. Within days, the effect on the Marines was severe. Several men were wounded without ever seeing who fired, and entire sections began to hesitate before advancing, unsure whether the next step would be their last. Morale eroded as quickly as the ground beneath their boots, and the constant tension left even veteran soldiers exhausted. Standard counter-sniper tactics, from sweeping patrols to heavy suppressive fire, achieved little against enemies who blended perfectly with leaves and shadow. What the Americans needed was not more bullets poured into the forest, but precision aimed at the right place. They needed someone who could notice the smallest flicker of movement and turn it into a decisive shot. Quietly, almost reluctantly, that someone was Basilone, and his so-called toy rifle was about to become something else entirely. What set Basilone apart was not bravery alone, but an understanding of how a tool could be matched to an environment. His mail-order rifle was lighter than the standard Marine weapon, which meant he could bring it up and settle it into position with less movement, a small advantage that mattered enormously in a jungle where even a shifting leaf could betray a shooter. The trigger was smoother as well, breaking cleanly instead of with the stiff resistance common to service rifles, allowing him to fire without disturbing his aim. Most important of all was the civilian scope mounted on top, a piece of glass designed for hunters who needed clarity at dawn and dusk, giving Basilone a brighter, sharper view through the dim green haze of Guadalcanal. He adapted his entire posture to this advantage. Instead of bracing against hard earth, he used hanging vines and low branches to steady the barrel, turning the jungle itself into a natural shooting rest. He kept himself in shadow, never silhouetted against the sky, and after every shot he shifted position, sometimes by only a few yards, sometimes by crawling through mud until the ground swallowed the sound of his movement. He was not fighting like a Marine trained for line battles. He was hunting, patiently and deliberately, as if the enemy were wary game in a familiar forest. Japanese snipers depended on remaining unseen, trusting that their camouflage and stillness would make them invisible. Basilone learned to look for the tiny betrayals of that illusion, the brief glint of a lens catching moonlight, the unnatural line of a barrel against leaves, or the subtle change in color where a face peered through a screen of green. He waited, sometimes for hours, until those clues aligned into a clear target. To observers, it would later seem like luck, but in truth, it was a careful method built on patience, optics, and an intimate knowledge of his rifle's behavior. Soon, it would be time to see if this idea actually worked. The first opportunity came quietly, the way most decisive moments do, when Basilone caught a faint shift in the pattern of leaves through his scope. A shape that did not belong was resting there, patient and confident, and he steadied his breath until the jungle seemed to hold still with him. One clean, controlled shot followed, and the hidden presence vanished, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the rain. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then another subtle movement drew his eye. Again he adjusted, again the rifle spoke, and again the forest swallowed the result. By the time darkness deepened, the pattern was clear. Several enemy shooters who have haunted the perimeter were no longer there, and the constant pressure on the Marines began to lift. Men who had been pinned behind fallen logs and shallow foxholes found they could rise and change positions without immediate fear. Even the officers noticed the difference, though they could scarcely believe what was happening. The catalog rifle they had dismissed as a toy was producing results that standard doctrine had not. But now the enemy knew someone was hunting them. The sudden quiet did not go unnoticed. The Japanese snipers who had ruled the ridgeline for days understood that someone was now hunting them with the same patience they once used on the Marines. They began to shift their positions, abandoning familiar trees and digging in behind new screens of foliage, hoping to break the pattern of Basilone's fire. Decoys appeared, crude imitations of heads and helmets raised on sticks, meant to draw a careless shot and reveal his location. From deeper in the jungle, rifles answered back, probing for the source of the threat that had turned their advantage into uncertainty. Basilone responded by never staying still. He slept in short, broken intervals, moving whenever the ground around him felt too familiar, and he learned to read the jungle as if it were a map written in shadows. Each new enemy trick forced him to refine his own, adjusting angles, waiting longer, or changing elevation to keep the advantage. What mattered was not speed, but timing, the ability to choose when the forest itself would betray the hidden figures within it. With every passing day, the pattern grew more pronounced. Another sniper would vanish, and another Marine patrol would move forward without taking fire. The balance was shifting, not through overwhelming force, but through careful, deliberate precision. To the men watching from the perimeter, Basilone became something like a ghost, rarely seen and rarely spoken of, yet always present in the sudden absence of danger. The enemy feared him, though they could not name him, and his own unit began to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding just beyond their sight. This was not luck, nor a fluke of circumstance, but the steady work of a marksman who had mastered both his rifle and the unforgiving terrain. And now, after days of silent struggle, came the moment when all of it would be counted. By the end of the fourth day, the tally was no longer a matter of rumor or hopeful counting. 11 enemy snipers had been confirmed gone, each one a silent threat removed from the jungle that had once seemed so hostile to the Marines. The ridgeline that had pinned entire squads in place now felt strangely open, as if a heavy curtain had been lifted from the battlefield. Patrols moved with a confidence they had not known in days, and the battalion could finally breathe again, no longer waiting for unseen eyes to find them in the undergrowth. What had begun as a desperate experiment with a mocked piece of equipment had delivered a result that official doctrine could not. The sniper threat was broken, and the balance of the fight had shifted. In the quiet that followed, one truth was impossible to ignore. The rifle they had laughed at had just changed the course of this battle. In the days that followed, the change in atmosphere was as noticeable as the drop in gunfire. Officers who had once dismissed Basilone's rifle now spoke to him with a new respect, asking questions instead of issuing warnings. The same piece of equipment that had been ridiculed as mail-order junk was treated carefully, as though its value had only just been discovered. Among the enlisted men, the shift was even more immediate. Marines who had watched friends fall without seeing their attacker now looked to Basilone as someone who could give them back a measure of safety. Requests for his help came quietly at first, a whispered suggestion that he might watch a particular sector or advise on where to set up a post. Each time he did, the pattern held, and the perimeter grew steadier. With the worst of the sniper threat gone, patrols could move, supplies could flow, and plans could be made again. The front line, once brittle and uncertain, began to stabilize, not because of new orders from above, but because one man's skill had forced everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew. After Guadalcanal, Basilone was no longer just another Marine in a crowded roster. Word of what he had accomplished spread quietly through the ranks, carried by those who had seen the difference his work made when everything else seemed to fail. His reputation grew not as a boastful legend, but as a practical example of what careful marksmanship and independent thinking could achieve under the worst conditions. Commanders began to listen when he spoke about sight lines, concealment, and patience, and younger Marines sought him out for advice on how to survive in terrain that favored the hidden over the bold. The methods he refined in the jungle did not remain his alone. As the war continued, elements of his approach filtered into training and field manuals, shaping how counter-sniper operations were conducted across the Pacific. The emphasis on precision, observation, and mobility proved more effective than the old reliance on volume of fire, and future engagements reflected that hard-earned lesson. As for the rifle itself, it became a quiet artifact of an extraordinary moment. Though it was never officially adopted, it was preserved as a reminder that innovation does not always come from factories or committees. Sometimes it comes from a single individual who knows his tools. What happened on that ridge was not just one successful fight, but a small shift in how modern war was understood. The story of Basilone and his unlikely rifle endures because it speaks to something deeper than any single battle. In a world governed by rigid rules and established hierarchies, it was one man's quiet confidence in his own skill that changed the outcome. Ingenuity proved stronger than doctrine, and careful mastery outweighed the labels placed on a tool or a person. What happened on that jungle ridge reminds us that progress is often born from those willing to trust their experience when institutions hesitate. These are the kinds of stories that risk being lost to time, overshadowed by larger campaigns and famous names. Yet they are just as vital to understanding how history is shaped. If you believe these forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, take a second to like this video to help rescue more of them. Subscribe to join our mission of preserving these hidden chapters. And in the comments, tell us where you are from or share a piece of your family's war history so this community can grow together.